Combat in D&D is weird. Do you ever find it really odd that people in D&D are ready to throw hands at a moment's notice? And I know it's not necessarily an original thought to say this, but like, really. A game master can, at any time, just say, roll initiative, and immediately a group of people are willing to be like,
let's dance, dickweed.
You wanna dance, Ron? I want a polka.
Come get a taste.
Like, what? Now, let me make it clear, I'm very aware that this is just a result of game design and mechanics, and D&D is a pretty combat-focused system, so therefore, there's going to be a large focus on said combat and understanding that combat is going to happen frequently in this game. However, I do think there is a large portion of storytelling and roleplay that can be unlocked if you dive further into the concept and ideas that combat is meant to represent. Truthfully, I think your entire game can evolve to an entirely different level of social roleplay if you just do one simple thing at the beginning of every combat. However, before we dive into that, let's make sure we understand just how we got here in the first place. See, combat truly is D&D's bread and butter. Is that combat well balanced? Well, not always, but frankly, I think that's a result of design choices. A lot of the times I mention D&D's struggling game balance, and people in my comments immediately start shouting at me saying, D&D sucks and Pathfinder is way better. Let me respond to that with something that might come as a genuine surprise. Yeah, I know. Pathfinder 2e's combat system is, in my opinion, far better balanced in every way, but the reason for that is because it is massively more in-depth with its rules, fringe scenario descriptions, and in-depth character creation. And yes, that's amazing, but it's certainly not accessible for the more casual players who desire more narrative aspects of TTRPGs. Basically what I'm saying is, everyone likes their games for different reasons, so maybe just let people like things? Life is way easier that way, I promise. Anyways, tangents aside, yeah, D&D's combat is not the most balanced in the world, but the system is focused on combat more than anything else. Which means, of course, the system is going to lean towards making combat happen more often than not. And thus, we get scenarios where initiative gets rolled frequently, and because the game basically encourages the mentality of initiative ends whenever the last enemy drops to 0, it means that people square up and duke it out to extreme degrees over any kind of dispute. And while yes, it might not always be to the death, it still is always wildly blown out of proportion. And I think honestly a large portion of this is because that D&D lacks a morale mechanic. In many TTRPGs and even past editions of D&D, at least in some cases, morale was the system that was used to decide when enemies would run away. Because it doesn't make sense to constantly try and fight to the death. However, in D&D 5e, this system is missing, meaning that enemies will blatantly and stupidly fight people who are way more powerful than them just because they can. Because there's no system that encourages them to run away.
Now stand aside, worthy adversary.
'Tis but a scratch.
A scratch? Your arm's off.
No, it isn't.
Well, what's that then?
I've heard worse.
You lie.
Like, seriously, consider.
Hey, these guys over here seem like easy pickings. What do you say we go ahead and get them for a few coins?
Really? The people decked out in magical gear and adventuring weapons? Those are the ones that you're gonna consider easy pickings?
Yeah, because they got all that heavy gear, it's gonna make them slower.
Well, it's hard to argue with that logic. Let's do it.
A few moments later.
Hey, give us your gold or we're gonna... sounds of burning and screaming will then play at this point.
I'm not gonna play any of these sounds, I'm just gonna have you saying all of them.
Oh my god, what have you done? You lit him on fire.
It's just a little fireball.
You're never gonna be the same again.
It's just,
Are you crazy?
no, it was just fireball.
For the rest of your
Just a
life.
cantrip.
Don't worry, man. We're gonna get you
It's not a big deal, it's just a cantrip.
Maybe we can scrounge up enough gold to maybe
It's just 1d10 damage.
Okay, it's okay.
You should just take a short rest.
The hat makes no sense. Why is the hat here? You know, I stopped putting sketches in my videos. I feel like there was a reason why. I should really trust my gut. Regardless, there is a common scenario. A simple, relative dangerous scenario that immediately advances to committing war crimes with little attempt for de-escalation. That's what happens in D&D with combat. This being said, however, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is because the system seems to clearly encourage this type of behavior. I'm not putting any judgment on any players for playing this way, which leads to the solution I alluded to earlier. How do you avoid the pitfall that comes with trying to prevent combat from escalating to this point? Well, there is something that I found which seems to typically work pretty well and also requires no extra effort on the part of the dungeon master. And that solution is to have your players ask themselves at the beginning of every single combat a very simple question: what is my character's goal in this fight? See, this does a few different things. Because rarely is the answer going to be as simple as, well, I want to kill whatever's in front of me, of course. Even if the goal is ultimately to kill the enemy, your players are more than likely going to dive deeper than that because of this question. They could say, my goal is to eliminate the threat against my party, which could be anything, not just killing. Or the goal might be, I want to protect my party from harm, which suddenly massively swaps your attention. You might have only focused on fighting the enemy before, but now you might use your action in a new, unique, and creative way you never thought possible. To make sure your party never gets hurt in combat means you're going to be focused solely on preventing hit point damage. Or honestly, it could have nothing to do with the actual combat. It could be the goal of a certain area, to achieve a certain task. The idea is to ask yourself, in this scenario, what does my character want most? And unless it's a very specific combat, the truth is, it's rarely going to be, I want everyone in this room dead and buried.
But if you don't, I will look for you. I will find you. And I will kill you.
It's funny because recently, in the process of scripting and researching this topic, I stumbled across one of Pointy Hat's videos, which I will be linking in the description because it's very well done and edited. While you're down there, by the way, do you want to hit the like button? Maybe the subscribe button? Just a thought that might help a little bit with the channel. Anyways, the video I'm talking about is a fantastic example on the importance of supplying additional goals other than just killing the enemy as a game master. But on that same level, I did find it interesting that the importance of this was levied at the game master specifically. Because shouldn't it be pointed at the players as well? Because at least in my mind, if you're wanting to play a more narrative-focused game that doesn't have a sole focus on kicking down doors and killing monsters, which by the way, there is nothing wrong with playing that way, but if you're not playing that way, your players should be thinking about this. I remember in one of the first campaigns I ever played in, one of the most bloodthirsty members of the party had a habit of intentionally keeping one of the enemies from dying. They'd often spend their efforts in combat actually actively trying to make sure at least one of the enemy combatants survived. Because that way they could tell them, go back and tell your associates what happened. Go back and tell them what happens if you come after us. And these direct actions led to a lot more story and plot points and interesting ways for the story to go. Suddenly, we weren't getting attacked by random bandits, we were getting attacked by people who were very aware of what we were capable of because it had been reported to them. Was it a smart move? Not really. Was it a fun, interesting, and narratively focused decision that could move the plot forward character-wise? Yeah. Oh yeah. And that's what I find most interesting more than anything else about this topic. You can almost always add more layers, more interesting scenarios, and more fascinating consequences so long as you keep one specific question in your head when creating combat encounters: why? Why does your character want to do this? And the natural consequences of asking such a question leads to combat no longer being just about rolling the biggest number and doing the most damage, although that will still be a factor, but now it is about juggling everyone's goals, watching a web of interesting decisions develop, and creating, well, a far more interesting and dynamic combat. And all of this is done without changing anything on the part of the Game Master. Nothing extra is put on them. This also means that if the Game Master employs the same techniques with their enemies while also taking advantage of the Pointy Hat video that I mentioned before and giving unique goals for every different combat encounter, do you know what you've done? You've added the story behind the combat. You've created exploration, social encounters, and combat all in one nice, neat package. And I think that could entertain any player so long as you keep all of this balance in mind. Because the most important lesson you can learn as a player, Game Master, or literally anything, is that the rules are there to add direction, but it's up to everyone at the table to add substance, to create that spice that truly creates that unique D&D experience. Without that, it just tastes bland. And that's no good. Add the Sonic clip.
That's no good.
You ain't sneezing, you ain't seasoning.
What does that mean? What does that mean? Regardless, combat is not meant to be something bland, something dull, something that is just there to cause damage to each other. Combat in many stories is meant to present an example of a physical interaction that shows the conflicts in the story. Combat is meant to be a portion of the story that moves it forward. And that can only happen if you consider what the characters are doing. Because D&D is a character-focused game. It is a character-driven game. And if you don't consider the character decisions in that combat, I feel you're missing out on a massive portion of storytelling in general. Does D&D fail to provide this sometimes? Yeah, absolutely. But that doesn't mean it's not easy to add in. And again, a lot of this does not put any effort on the part of the Dungeon Master. So do that, focus on this question, and make sure your players ask themselves this. And I think you can run a fantastic game with really interesting combat encounters. Like I said earlier in the video, liking and subscribing does help a lot, but you know what would be even more helpful? If you did that and also commented, but also more importantly, if you just ran a good game and kept doing so. That's all I ever want to do, is to help you guys do that. So I hope you have a fantastic time. Go out into the world, make it your own, and never forget to play your role. You beautiful bastards.
And don't forget, if you ain't sneezing, you ain't seizing.
What does that mean?